All right. So the next section we're going to talk about is the Southern Strategy, and essentially the rise of the modern Republican Party that really became the form in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, particularly around these four people: George Wallace in the late 50s and early 60s, 19 Barry Goldwater in 1964 election against LBJ, Nixon in 68, and then Reagan in the 80s. And they really, solidified this strategy, one of the founding strategies of the modern Republican Party, around what's called the Southern Strategy, which is basically using these new version of coded racism to continue pushing racist policies that attract a lot of white voters who, that win their vote without making everyone, feel like, racist or feel like race is even, has anything to do with it. And not to say that, there's a lot of other things too that went into the construction of the modern Republican Party. For sure, the Cold War. A lot of different views on economics. A lot of views on around different kinds of rights. LGBTQ rights. There was a huge anti-feminist movement in the 80s. Religious movements. Different views on liberty and as well. So there's a lot of things that went into the modern Republican Party. So I'm not saying this is the main thing that created it, but this is a very a significant strategy that helped found the modern Republican Party, and it's something that's still being used today, and it's something that we all need to understand, because this isn't just a strategy for the South. This is something that is a nationwide strategy that people have been, the Republican Party has been using since particularly since the 1964 election. So we really need to understand this strategy. Um, before I dive into the Southern Strategy, I want to talk about what was there before the Southern Strategy. Before the 60s civil rights movements and the civil rights bills, particularly the 1964 civil rights bills that outlawed basically Jim Crow and legalized segregation. So since the Civil War, so there's been, particularly after the Civil War, there's been a lot of anti-Black false narratives that were pushed on a lot of white people, particularly Southern white people, but addition, all white people all over the country. And these narratives, these narratives have been around a long time. Anti-Black narratives. They started with Portugal, in the 1400s when they decided to make a whole lot of money and wealth off of enslaving Africans and creating an African, a transatlantic slave system. So they created this narrative that all Black Africans were part of one Black race. They were all inferior, they're savage. We were actually helping them out by enslaving them and bringing them Christianity and civilization, and that was all great. So that, was the start of the first anti-Black, narrative that Black people were these inferior and savage and uncivilized. And then we bring them over and enslave them, but then all of a sudden, you can't have all these savages, millions of savages, enslaved in this country because that could be dangerous. So they start pushing these anti-Black narratives that Black people are, docile and slow and inferior, and they need white people to protect them. And they just, if they had their freedom, they wouldn't know what to do with it, and they'd be in danger themselves and society. So that that helps justify slavery. But then, when slavery ended, the South really wanted to take back control of the South. They wanted to continue white supremacy in this racial hierarchy. But they couldn't just implement all this lynching and sharecropping and convict leasing, voter suppression. They couldn't just do that, from nowhere. So they created this narrative that all of a sudden Black people were criminals, or they were these violent, savage criminals, kind of going back to the African, Portugal anti-Black narratives, that all Black people were criminals and rapists, and that they had to be controlled using violence and particularly racial segregation. So segregation was a huge, form of protection for white people, not only for white people, but for this another anti-Black narrative about the purity of the white race. And this goes back. We're going to talk more about this in the religious rights section, but this goes back all the way to the blood purity, themes in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. That if Muslims and Jewish people mixed with Christianity, it would taint the blood, and it could be the downfall of Christianity. So you had to keep blood pure, and then that so that kind of those ideas, form around, during, slavery time in the U.S., where we all of a sudden have these new perverse forms of Christianity that are teaching that, white Christianity and white, the white race and the Western world is embodied in the white woman's purity. And they would have all these preachers preach about, the most moral thing that you can do is protect a white woman, particularly against, black people. Because if there was what we call miscegenation, I can never say this, or miscegenation, if we had miscegenation, if we had black and white people mixing, that would, destroy white Christianity, destroy the white race, and then eventually destroy the Western world. And this was, it sounds extreme, but this was like, especially in the South, this was being preached by just about every, the vast majority of churches were preaching this kind of this religion, this perspective of Christianity, and and not just churches, but this was a common theme, throughout the South, and not just the South, but all over the country as well, but particularly the South, was this idea that we had to protect the white race, particularly white women, from black people, by through enforcing racial segregation that was also reinforced by violence, whether it be lynching or state violence, or all or racial hierarchy enforced by police violence. So we had those two realities, and then especially particularly like when the FDR's New Deal came on board, and when the idea of social welfare came on board, white people loved welfare, particularly when it first came. When it was about widow programs, and it was mainly serving poor white people, because poor white people saw poor white people as these like deserving poor people, particularly white widows. After World War One. So that's where the origins, and we'll have a whole class on the history of welfare racism, but that's where the origins of a lot of our welfare programs come from. And then that was great until LBJ's Great Society really opened up a lot of these welfare programs to more black people, and that is when we start seeing these narratives that black people were this undeserving poor, and then that they were taking advantage of these welfare systems, they were abusing the government. They had these they had these different things, like poor white women were expected to it was great for them to take care of these programs, because then they can stay at home and raise their kids, and that was part of their domestic duties. But poor black women, they were expected to work, and if they took advantage of these programs to raise their kids, they were, called welfare queens and criticized. So you start seeing not only that black people are criminals and rapists, and that we need to protect the white race from them, but also any programs to help them out are just going to, they're just going to abuse. So you start, these are some, there's a lot more anti-black narratives going on around, particularly from the end of the Civil War, until, the 50s and 60s. So this is the environment where all of a sudden, LBJ passes the 1964 Civil Rights Act that all of a sudden takes away, all these barriers that they set up to protect themselves against these false narratives that black people were dangerous. You can't let them in the suburbs because they'll destroy our neighborhoods and bring crime. All of a sudden, LBJ starts taking down these, outlaws Jim Crow, outlaws racial segregation, removes these barriers that are protecting all these white people. And this just scares a lot of white people, and especially white voters. And at the same time, there's this like civil rights movement that's happening at the same time that this the widespread, that all these homes start buying TVs. So in the 50s, all of a sudden, all these homes have TVs, and it's the first time, majority of households have TVs, and there's only a couple channels, and all of them are sending reporters with cameras down to these, Alabama to record these, 50s and 60s civil rights, marches that are just being met by horrific brutality, where dogs attacking children, and like, police beating them up, and all of a sudden, the North and West, we're always told that we had, segregation was something that was great for everyone. And then they're all of a sudden seeing what, for the first time, the brutality that came with Jim Crow. And all of a sudden it was very less socially acceptable to be an open racist, to openly be, joining the KKK, or talking about lynching, or talking about segregation. So that, became way less socially acceptable. So right about that time is when the modern Republican Party forms, and we'll talk about each step and how that forms, starting from Wallace to Goldwater to Nixon. But they decide to create this new party. Particularly, I mean, the defining moment was after the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. That's when we start immediately seeing people like Strom Thurmond and Dixiecrats move to the Republican Party, and they start this new Southern strategy where they start, defining, pushing the same racist policies of housing discrimination and segregation and violence against Black people, but they do it in a much more socially acceptable and coded way, where it doesn't even feel like race anymore. So instead of supporting lynching and the KKK and violence against Black people, you start seeing people like Nixon talk about law and order. And there's nothing wrong with like wanting law and order, like, I mean, no one wants to live in chaos, but you only hear law and order when it has to do with civil rights activists or people protesting their oppression. That could be like, peacefully protesting or violently, we see riots and things like that. And we see this even to this day, like what's happening after George Floyd. There, vast majority, like 95% of the protests are peaceful, but then there are some rioting as well. But Trump is responding to all that with law and order. We need more law and order, which is this code for let's violently crack down on Black people or trying to raise up against their oppression. And you can see that, like this comic is a great example because, especially in '67, there was a lot of peaceful protests, but there was also a lot of riots as well. And just because but they were both fighting the same oppression. They're both fighting police brutality, fighting white, housing discrimination, and I'm not I'm not, for violence, but I'm also not going to dismiss these riots, dismiss the oppression these people are living in on a daily basis, just because, I mean, to be honest, most of us in these same circumstances would probably riot. So it's important, but that's, they're able to reframe this. So, all of a sudden, this isn't about repressing Black people, and this is about, law and order and just wanting to, bring, order to the chaos. So it's not even about race anymore, when in reality it is completely about race. Or so instead of supporting housing discrimination and segregation, you can start supporting, suburbs and exclusionary zoning and free markets, and school choice. And like a big one, instead of imposing, desegregation, let's oppose busing. So busing, particularly in the 70s and 80s, was a strategy of desegregation, a very successful strategy that Nixon and Reagan honed in on. And they never talked about I oppose integration, but they opposed the methods of integration. They just focused on busing. So all of a sudden, all these white rallies all over the country, they weren't, they would talk about, I'm not racist, I just don't like busing, or I don't like all, I want school choice, which is just a fancy word for, neighborhood schools and continued segregation, or strategies to continue segregation. So, and instead of opposing Black people, instead of saying Black people, shouldn't get welfare, we can support welfare reform, or we support, small government or tax cuts and things like that. So we'll talk about how they, throughout the section, how they use things like that as this nice coded way to essentially push policies that hurt Black people and Black communities. So it's important to understand when I talk about, the Republican Party is going after the white vote, I mean, yes, there was a lot of openly racist people as well, but a lot of people, even today, a lot of people don't feel like they're racist. They don't even think race is an issue. They just want law and order. They just want, school choice. They just want, small governments. But what they don't understand is a lot of that is still pushing, racist policies. It's still electing politicians that are pushing racist policies that are hurting Black communities. So that's when I talk about, this coded racism and the kind of, it's in a way, it is, reaching certain part, especially after all this, after centuries of just these anti-Black narratives, it was really easy for the Republican Party to tap into that after the 60 civil rights bills. And that's what we're going to really dive into in this section today. All right, So next thing I want to talk about is the Southern Strategy, and I want to talk about what it is and also what it is not, and that's probably even more important because a lot of people who claim it doesn't exist or claim that it's something that happened a long time ago and it's not something that still happens today really don't understand what the Southern Strategy is, and that's really important to understand. So the Southern Strategy is essentially a Republican strategy that was created early 50s, but really perfected between the 60s to the 80s, was a strategy to win over white voters, using white racism, white resentment, oftentimes, as we talked about, also white fear against about black people coming into their suburbs, black people coming into their community, to their schools, or black people abusing welfare systems, or government assistance programs that used to be only for white people. So you're kind of tapping into this kind of resentment or this fear around civil rights progress and or desegregation, in order to gain votes. And that's really important to understand, because it's not, I mean, it oftentimes is very coded, like George Wallace was the first to use this. So George Wallace, this is a picture of him in 1963, where he was opposing federal integration of University of Alabama. And it was a big publicity stunt, and like he, talked about, he gave this big speech, but he didn't come out and just say, hey, black people are bad, and we need to, segregate from them. Instead, he coded it much more like, he called it states' rights. He made it more into like a states' rights argument. This isn't about race or racism. This is about states' rights. It's about the right of the state to do what it thinks is best. The big federal government is coming in and forcing us to do things that are against our best wishes. Well, in reality, I mean, he just wanted to continue racial, desegregation. He wanted to continue Jim Crow. But it was a really nice way to code it, and then people really responded to that as well. I mean, he got, after this publicity stunt, he got hundreds of thousands of letters of encouragement from all over the country. So people really responded to this. So instead of saying words like N-word, talking about lynching or encouraging Jim Crow, instead we pushed this, the same policies of housing discrimination and racial segregation and violence, but they coded it into things like states' rights. We just want states' rights, or law and order was, instead of talking about how we need to violently crack down on black people that are trying to stand up for their rights. Instead, we can talk about we just need law and order, and there's just too much chaos in the streets. Busing, instead of talking about, how we need segregation and all those things, we just talk about, oh no, busing is a violation of rights and a waste of, funding, government funding. So we started coding these things, and we saw that white people really really responded to this. Again, I mean, like, this isn't the main strategy that this isn't the only strategy that created the Republican Party, but it's one of the main strategies that really helped them dominate our political scene since LBJ in 1964. So LBJ was literally the last president, the Democrat president, to win the white majority. And since then, the Republican Party has just dominated our politics. And it's not just them alone. It's also like the religious right in the 80s, started adopting racial dog whistles and Southern strategy. The right-wing media, formed, from Rush Limbaugh to Fox News in the 90s that started adopting these strategies. So, there's a lot, we start seeing that that there's a lot of parts of the political right that start adopting this this coded racism to continue winning big over the last half century. And we see that Republicans, the Republican Party has won 8 out of 13 presidential elections since 1964. We talk about we're in the middle of this horrific Supreme Court justice battle, but if we look back, the Republican Party has appointed 15 out of 19 Supreme Court justices since the LBJ. So I mean, even though 60s, we think about, it's the civil rights gains and cultural gains. There was a lot of great victories, but politically speaking, the conservatives and the political right has dominated our government, on the presidential level to the state level. And again, I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of strategies, Red Scare, anti-feminism, different economic views, different views on liberty, individual liberty versus social liberty, all this stuff. There's a lot of things to this, but the Southern Strategy was a significant component that is still being used today. So I want to talk about what it is not, which is a lot of people claim that it doesn't exist, or that it's only, it's a thing of the past, or particularly that it was only used in the South. People will claim, critics will claim that, because Carter won most of the South, that that this isn't that thing anymore. But reality, like George Wallace, after he stood, made a his big speech about states' rights and the right of states to continue segregation. I mean, there was letters all over he received over 100,000 letters all over the country, letters of support. So that this is not a strategy just used for the South, and it started out as a South, but particularly like Nixon and Wallace and Reagan realized really quickly that this was a strategy that could be used to gain white voters, all over the country, particularly in areas that were being forced to desegregate their schools, and were being forced to desegregate, where Black people were starting to move into the communities, where Black people were starting to gain government assistance programs. So you just see all this is happening all over the country, and you're seeing this white resentment and this white fear against all this racial progress, and that results into winning a lot of voters for the Republican Party. George Wallace, realized in 1963, after he received, most of his, all of his letters of praise, he said, they all hate Black people, all of them. They're all afraid, all of them. Great God, that's it. They're all Southern. The whole United States is Southern. But what is not as well is it's not the sole explanation for the political realignment. So we call this the political realignment. Essentially, the Democrats and Republicans from the 50s, up until like the 80s, did a realignment where they kind of switched a lot of views, particularly around civil rights. The Democrats were anti-civil rights after the Civil War, and very for pro-white supremacy, but starting FDR and Truman, we start seeing a reversal of that, and Democrats are being pushed in the opposite direction, and that's when all the Dixiecrats jump ship like Strom Thurmond, and we start seeing a new Republican Party that originally was Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, was this party against slavery, again it was for Black rights, and I mean certain levels of Black rights. And you start seeing them, kind of go in the other direction, where they start, more pursuing white voters through this, coded racism. So this isn't, so the Southern Strategy was a big reason for this political realignment, but it wasn't the only reason. There were a lot of other factors that kind of helped, and we'll be talking about most of those factors throughout this presentation. And people talk about, well, this is something that happened in the past; it doesn't happen anymore, and that's just, simply not true. This is something that is still with us in many ways. People claim that Trump, because he's very explicitly racist, that he doesn't use racial dog whistles. But what we're going to see in this presentation is he probably uses them, just as much, if not more, than a lot of the founders of Nixon and Reagan. So making America great, law and order, illegals, draining the swamp, protecting suburbs, Antifada, cancel culture, all these things that he uses that push it is like coded racism that doesn't feel racist, like make America great again. That doesn't feel racist, but when you really look at what he's talking about, that was a slogan that Reagan first used, and when he talked about how great it was before all the civil rights, legislation, and before, before Black people were able to, sue for discrimination, before affirmative action, he would talk about how great, everything was, and that's what they're tapping into. All right, so like I said, a lot of people will claim that the Southern Strategy doesn't exist, or it was made up. But what we know about the Southern Strategy actually came from Republicans bragging about how successful they were. I'm just going to read, there's a whole list of quotes about how successful the Southern Strategy was. I'm just going to read a couple of them, and we're going to dive deeper into this and talk about each one of these people throughout the section. But just wanted to show you that what we know about the Southern Strategy came from Republicans talking about how successful it was. Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, wrote in 1968, after Nixon, returned to this law and order Southern, racial dog whistle campaign, he wrote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." John Elkerman, another Nixon special counsel, wrote, this was after they declared a war on crime and war on drugs. He said, you want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black people, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Do you know, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And that's, talking about there really wasn't a huge drug issue at the time. What there was a huge civil rights movement that was, peaceful and nonviolent, or peaceful and violent. And so this is where, war on drugs was an extension of this law and order of how they can, criminalize a lot of these black, civil rights leaders. This is a really good one. Lee Atwater, he was a political strategist for Ronald Reagan in the 80s and George W. Bush, and was integral in really defining this. But he said in an interview, you start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. He obviously said the actual word. He didn't say N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busting, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all those things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. So that's really important because we're going to talk more about this idea. Like cutting taxes just seems, like it has nothing to do with race, but and it doesn't have to. You can cut taxes and not, push racist policies. But almost always, when the Republicans talk about cutting taxes, they're talking about cutting. And they're also that what follows cutting taxes is also cutting social programs that they deem are helping, black people, or even, even in many social welfare programs, actually white people benefit the most from, but there's this perception that black people are abusing the system and benefiting more. So, so that's why we want to cut taxes and also cut social programs. And it seems like totally economic things, as Lee Atwater says, but the byproduct of them is blacks gets hurt worse than whites. And this is like during Reagan's era, where neoliberal area, where not only did he give huge tax cuts to the rich and corporations, but he also cut huge spending cuts and social programs, social welfare programs, social safety net, public health programs, particularly aimed at black urban communities. And we're going to talk more about just like the damage that he was able to do while pretending like to the black community, while pretending like none of this was actually racist. And then Michael Steele, the chairman of the Republican Party, actually in his 2010 speech, actually says, for the last 40 years, we had a Southern strategy that alienated many minority voters by focusing on the white male vote in the South. So yeah, this is definitely a thing. This is definitely, we're going to dive deeper into a lot of these quotes, but I just wanted to kind of put that up there because there's a lot of people probably right by now being like, yeah, this isn't a thing, but let's just dive a little bit deeper. So first, before we dive into the history of the Southern Strategy, I want to give a little bit of background between, the Civil War up until, like the 60s and 70s of the political realignment that we're talking about. So this is kind of like a basic history. It doesn't talk about race that much. It doesn't talk about too many controversial things, but it's going to lay a foundation. And then after this video, we're going to add to that foundation. So I'm going to just play this quick video by Vox.
Today's Republican Party opposes big government. It's culturally conservative. Its demographic support is strongest among white voters, and it usually dominates elections in the South. The party's 2016 presidential nominee has been heavily criticized for inciting racial tensions. But things weren't always this way. Over the past 160 years or so, the party has undergone a remarkable transformation from the party of Abraham Lincoln to the party of Donald Trump. To understand how the GOP got this way, you have to go back to when it first came into existence in 1854, just 7 years before the Civil War. There are two parties at this point, the Whigs and the Democrats. America is quickly expanding westward, and there's an intense debate over whether or not new states should permit slavery. The Democratic Party, with strong support in the South, has become increasingly pro-slavery. But the Whigs are divided on the issue. Their northern supporters are really afraid that the growing number of slave states would have too much political influence, which they feared could really hurt free white workers economically. So in 1854, the country is debating whether or not the territories of Kansas and Nebraska should allow slavery. The Whigs can't agree, and the party ends up collapsing. The former Whigs in the North form a new party that will fight against letting slavery expand any further. They call it the Republican Party. By 1860, the Republican Party has become increasingly powerful in the North, enough so that a little-known Republican named Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. Even though Lincoln promises he won't interfere with slavery in states that already have it, he and his party are still too anti-slavery for the South to tolerate. So 11 southern states secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The northern states decide to fight to keep the Union together, and the Civil War ensues. The result is a northern victory and the abolition of slavery nationwide. After the war, Republicans begin fighting to ensure that recently freed slaves in the South have their rights. A year after Lincoln's assassination, the party passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They fight to make sure that black men have the same right to vote, with new laws and constitutional amendments. But something had happened during the Civil War that began changing the young Republican Party. Government spending during the war made many northern businessmen really rich. Gradually, these wealthy financiers and industrialists start taking more and more of a leadership role in the Republican Party. They want to hold on to power, and they don't think that fighting for black rights in a mostly white country is the best way to do that. Meanwhile, the South is resisting these new racial reforms, often violently. And most white Republican voters and leaders now feel that they've done enough for black citizens in the South, and it's time to emphasize other issues. So in 1870, the party basically gives up on reforming the South, deciding instead to leave it to its own devices. The region becomes politically dominated by white Democrats. Fast forward to the new century. By the 1920s, the Republican Party has become essentially the party of big business. This works out quite well for them as the economy is booming, but not so well when the economy crashes in 1929 and the Great Depression begins. Franklin D. Roosevelt and other Democrats are swept into power and begin dramatically expanding the size and role of the federal government in an attempt to fight the Depression and better provide for Americans. Republicans oppose this rapid expansion, defining themselves as opposition to big government, an identity that the party still holds today. Going into the 50s and 60s, race and the South returned to the forefront of national politics, with the civil rights movement attempting to end segregation and ensure blacks truly have the right to vote. The civil rights debate isn't a purely partisan issue. It's more of a regional issue, with Northerners from both parties supporting it and Southerners from both parties opposing it. Then, in 1964, it's Democratic President Lyndon Johnson who signs the Civil Rights Act into law. And it's Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater who opposes it, arguing that it expands government power too much. A massive switch-up takes place. Black voters, some of whom had already been shifting from the Republican Party, convert almost entirely to their new advocates, the Democrats. The white voters in the South, who had been staunch Democrats, start to really resent the big government interference here and in other matters like abortion rights and school prayer. Over the next 3 decades, whites in the South switch to the GOP, which makes the South an overwhelmingly Republican region. By the 1980s, the party begins to resemble the GOP we are familiar with today. Republicans elect Ronald Reagan, who promises to fight for business interests, lower taxes, and traditional family values.
All right, so I think that's a good place to stop. It's a, video goes on for a little bit longer if you want to watch it on YouTube, but I think it's important to understand, like, part of this political realignment, the roots of it really had to do with this, kind of anti-New Deal, where the Republicans, became, more of a big business interest. So when the New Deal, which is, the opposite of free market capitalism, came into existence, that was really what Republicans kind of rallied around, this idea of opposing the New Deal, particularly when in the '60s when Barry Goldwater, was entire most of his platform was based on the New Deal, and that really was, and so for a while, both parties were kind of, we'll watch the study, research, we'll show a study, but both parties weren't particularly pro or anti-black, or anti-civil rights or desegregation for a while. It was more about, pro, if you were for the New Deal or against the New Deal. It had a lot to do about the Red Scare and things like that. But it really wasn't. Slowly, Democrat leaders started, focusing on, segregation, desegregation policies, and which really, blew up in the '50s and '60s. And that when we start seeing this anti-New Deal party really mixed with this, anti, desegregation and anti, civil rights party, that we see now today. So again, so it's not all about race, but a lot of it had to do with New Deal, whether you're for or against the New Deal, and that really mixed with race, in the '50s and '60s, particularly around civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation. Um, so yeah, this is a great chart that kind of shows like the political realignment that really started happening in the '60s. So we can see this. There's a really great article, Vox, if you want to dive a little bit deeper in each one of these maps. But this is, we see this, JFK. Kind of, it was a pretty divided election. Like, he barely won, but it's kind of the complete opposite. Where the majority of the South is Democrat, majority California is Republican. Very opposite of what we see now. And then LBJ, takes over and fights Barry Goldwater and just dominates the election. But Barry Goldwater is able to using an anti-civil rights platform, is able to win a lot of the South. And that's really where we start seeing, we'll dive deeper into that, where we'll start seeing this creation of his Southern strategy. And then, the next election, Nixon is fighting, LBJ's VP, Hubert Humphrey. And again, Nixon barely wins. He last second kind of adopts a Southern strategy when he notices that George Wallace is running as independent, and George Wallace, his whole campaign is racial dog whistles and states' rights and things like that, and he actually wins a big deal of the South, because Nixon wasn't, Nixon was able to kind of the last second, get enough votes to win. But then, that proves to Nixon that there's something to this racial dog whistling. So he launches a full Southern strategy in '72, and he wins more voters than LBJ in '64. He just dominates with his Southern strategy. And then, we see that, Carter comes back. Carter is the Southern, evangelical, so he's able to win a lot of the South, but we still see, like the West and California and the West Coast are still Republican, but and then he loses to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan just launches this all-out Southern strategy about welfare queens and states' rights and cutting taxes and all these things, and he just dominates for 2 elections and wins majority of the country. He wins a lot of Democrats over, which really is what the inspiration for later. If we go to Clinton, Clinton runs on this campaign called the New Democrats, which is the idea of trying to kind of out neoliberal, the Republicans, kind of be a strong, being tougher on crime, being tougher on welfare, tougher on immigration, and we're going to talk about his racial dog whistles as well. But he actually wins back a lot of this and does really well with this. But then we start seeing kind of like the maps starting to look more to how it is now, like the Democrats in the Northeast and in the West and in the South is still getting pretty red. Then we see George Bush, again we see he starts forming this political realignment that we and then Obama wins in 2008, 2016. That really kind of solidifies the alignment that we're in right now. And that takes us to 2016 with Trump. and Clinton. And these are much more familiar political climate. So that's kind of like in a nutshell, but we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper and talk a little bit about how this happens throughout this section. So I want to just show this Dwight Eisenhower's Republican Party platform in 1956. And this is important to understand. I mean, there's a lot of criticism behind Eisenhower. He did some really horrific things, like he toppled over some really amazing democratic governments in Iran and Guatemala, and we're still paying the price for that. So he wasn't perfect, but if you look at his platform in 1956, I mean, he wanted to raise the federal minimum wage, he wanted to expand Social Security, he wanted to increase funding for hospitals, increase federal aid for healthcare and housing. He wanted to support, increase public health research, support DC becoming a state, constitutional amendment, establishing equal rights for men and women. So if you look at that, this is basically the Democrat platform right now. So that's what we're going to try to explain. How did we go from here to where we're at now, where the Republicans, I would say, oppose most of these things. And that really started with, we have to go back to the end of the Civil War. So when the Civil War ended, there was this brief moment called Reconstruction of about a decade where there was this attempt, particularly by radical Republicans and then Lincoln's party, attempt to try to create this egalitarian society in the South, where at least blacks were somewhat equal and could vote and could, do what they want. And that was quickly overturned by this return to white supremacy, this with what we call redeemers, where these Democrats that they were ex-Confederates, Democrats that through violence, through the KKK, through voter suppression, through black codes and Jim Crow laws, were able to kind of recapture the South and just dominate the South for the next century through voter suppression, Jim Crow, and terrorism. It was a pretty horrific time for black people. And that, became what we call the Solid South. So essentially, from the 1877 and the Reconstruction to 1964, the Civil Rights Bill, in this time period, if anyone, tried to pass, basically the Southern voting bloc stopped any piece of legislation that either was for, civil rights of black people or for desegregation or anything like that. It just wouldn't pass. Even FDR's New Deal, in order to pass that, and to get the Southern support, he had to find these clever ways to exclude black people. Like, in his new worker rights and Social Security programs, they excluded farm workers and domestic workers, where most black people worked. And his housing administration, they created redlining maps where they're able to avoid giving black people, home loans. Like 98% of home loans from 34 to 68 with the Fair Housing Act went to white people. So they had to be very creative. So if there was anything that was being passed, if it was going to get Southern support, which they needed to pass most things, they had to find ways to exclude black people. And so, and then we start seeing some of these, Democrats, from Truman. They start seeing, particularly like after World War II, it was pretty embarrassing. After we just defeated the Nazis, who created a society on racial hierarchies, and all of a sudden everyone's looking at us and wondering why we have a racial hierarchy society with Jim Crow. So we start seeing from international pressure, people like Truman start desegregating, initiating desegregation orders. We're going to talk a lot more about this during our segregation class, but this really started upsetting the Southern, the voting bloc, particularly so much they created what we call the Dixiecrats, in like the 40s and 50s. They were basically they tried to, after 1948, after Truman desegregated the army, they walked out of the Democratic convention and created their own party called the States' Rights, and they called themselves Dixiecrats. And the Dixiecrats were basically Democrats who opposed any kind of civil rights efforts or desegregation. They elected Strom Thurmond. He was a senator from South Carolina that spent a half century. I mean, this guy opposed anything that had to, that would benefit Black people. And he did, anti-lynching bills, civil rights bills, and he served for 50 years. And he did a lot of destruction in that time period. But, so he, was the head of this party. They actually won a couple states in the South, and they won, several million or 1 million votes. But they didn't win the election. So they eventually went back to the Democratic parties and just decided to be Dixiecrats and the Democrats. And just, they were integral to stopping any kind of civil rights and desegregation for the next decade. Like when Brown versus Board, got initiated to desegregate schools that was supposed to happen immediately. I mean, they were responsible for delaying that decision for decades. So this quote from Equal Justice Initiative says, virtually no desegregation occurred in any state of the former Confederacy until 1957, leading one Black congressman to concede that the South had won the first round in the battle for compliance. So when we start seeing these more and more desegregation happens, particularly on the judicial level, like Brown versus Board in 1954 outlaws segregation in schools and in general. Montgomery bus boycott. That launched Supreme Court cases that outlawed separate but equal public transportation accommodations. We see public housing, public buses are the Boston versus Virginia ruled segregated public buses were unconstitutional and launches the whole freedom riders, the people that would go in the South and basically get beat up trying to forcing the federal government to enforce these new rules. And then ultimately the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, LBJ was probably one of the few politicians that could probably pass this. He was a master politician. Say what you will, I don't think many people could have negotiated this, but he also used, JFK's assassination to kind of help push this forward, but he did that, which basically outlawed Jim Crow and legal segregation. And that's after that, no, Democrat won the white vote. After that, white voters, completely shifted to the Republican Party. So let's talk about the beginning of the Southern Strategy. So this really started in the late 50s with this guy named George Wallace. So George Wallace, this is the problem with a lot of these people like George Wallace and Nixon and Goldwater. At one point, they were very pro civil rights. He actually, he ran for the governor of Alabama in 1958, and he actually got the NAACP, endorsement. He rejected the KKK who tried to endorse him. He was very, he was a pro civil rights, and he lost horribly. And then he realized, and his candidate was super openly racist candidate, John Patterson. So he says this after that he realized he lost right before his concession speech. I was out N-word by John Patterson. I'll tell you here and now, I will never be out N-word again. And then so he runs for the next in '62 he runs again for Alabama governor. He takes a whole hardline approach on segregation. He's basically anti-segregationist, pro states' rights platform, and he wins the Alabama governorship. So, and then he, 1963, he does that publicity stunt where he stands in the doorway and tries to block, the Black students from, coming into the University of Alabama. It was completely staged. He had, mark tape on the floor where he was supposed to stand. It was set up, it was a huge publicity stunt. But instead of doing the normal Black people or savages and we need to, segregate ourselves from them, instead he completely talked about just states' rights and how the federal government was overreaching and violating states' rights instead of talking about white supremacy. And that that was taped and broadcast all over the country. And he received fan mail from over 100,000 white people all over the country, not just in the South, who really supported what he did, particularly how he framed it as a states' rights thing. This isn't even about race. This is about states' rights. When in reality, this is 100% about race. And so he realized after that, overtures of racial resentment wasn't just, a popular thing in the South, but it was all over the country. And he realized that he could be much more effective and gain much more white voters if he decoded this, instead of saying, lynching and Jim Crow and N-word, he talked about states' rights and federal overreach and law and order, that white people would be much more comfortable, voting for him than being, this is also the time period when Bull Connor and all these people are getting taped, violently oppressing black people, and sicking dogs on children. So it's, so this was Ian Henry Lopez talks about Wallace pioneered a kind of soft porn racism in which fear and hate could be mobilized without mentioning race itself, except to deny that one is racist. So this gave this socially acceptable way to support racist policies while being able to deny openly, or even deny to yourself that you're racist, or you're not even a racist, you're supporting racist policies. So Wallace gave white people the ability to oppose black equality and integration without having to admit or even realize themselves and their own racial attitudes. So this, created a socially acceptable racism that white people really, jumped at and voted, big for Wallace, and future people that use the same tactic. And George Wallace wrote, many years later, he wrote, I started off talking about schools and highways and prisons and taxes, and I couldn't make them listen. Then I began talking about N-words, and they stomped the floor. And we talk about, our last section was about strategic racism and how a lot of these people, their main goal wasn't to be racist, it was to win elections, and they just realized that, they can manipulate racism to win those elections. And then came the 1964 Act. I'm gonna read this. Zach Beauchamp, wrote that year, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, and the Republicans nominated an opponent of the legislation, Barry Goldwater, to the presidency. The Johnson-Goldwater race cemented a long-running transformation of the Democratic Party into a multi-ethnic party of civil rights, forcing out the white Southerners who had been the party's base since the 19th century. These white Southerners defected to the GOP. This had a critical effect on American politics. It concentrated the nation's most racist voters into one party. So the Civil Rights Act, what it did is it outlawed explicit, or what we call de jure, public discrimination, like Jim Crow laws that explicitly said black people couldn't go to this school or drink from this fountain or ride in this bus. But what it didn't do is it left alone de facto discrimination, and that was what was happening, all over the North and West, like redlining, banking discrimination, voter, different, clever ways of voter suppression. So there was actually, even in order to get the votes that Lyndon Johnson got to get the votes that he needed to pass this, a lot of Northern politicians, I mean, they were okay looking at the South and saying, look at these like racist, backwards Southerners, let's like punish them and take away, Jim Crow, but at the same time, they weren't willing to desegregate Northern schools and Western schools. So they actually left an anti-busing provision that allowed them to continue fighting busing, in the North and the West for many decades after this. Ember Kendi writes this great quote that talks about like the shortcomings of the 64 Civil Rights Act too. He says, and so as much as the Civil Rights Act served to erect a dam against Jim Crow policies, it also opened up the floodgates for new racist ideas to pour in, including the most racist idea to date. It was an idea that ignored the white head start, presumed that discrimination had been eliminated, presumed that equal opportunity had taken over, and figured that since blacks were still losing the racial disparities and their continued losses must be their fault. Black people must be inferior, and equalizing policies like eliminating or reducing white seniority or instituting affirmative action policies would just be unjust and ineffective. The Civil Rights Act of '64 managed to bring on racial progress and progression of racism at the same time. So what this is saying is, they recognized that there was this, horrible racism and discrimination happening. All they did was just outlaw it, parts of it from continuing. They didn't do anything, for reparations. They didn't, do anything to repair back past damage. In fact, it gave this like image that Republicans still to use to this day. Like it was 2 years ago, there was a reparations Senate hearing, and Mitch McConnell said, we don't need reparations. We had the civil rights bills, because there's this myth that, everything was fixed after the civil rights bills, when in fact, like even, Dr. King said that his dream turned into a nightmare, and he said that without economic justice, we would never have equality in this country. So that's important to understand that this was a great piece of legislation, but it also fell short, and it did not fix racism or white supremacy at all. It did not fix, past harm. It just took away some powerful, tools of racism and racial discrimination. So again, the video talks about the voting breakdown at the time. The Democrats and Republicans, it was mainly a North and South thing. The North, was for it, on both parties, and the South was against it on both parties. And really, there was all these polls in '62 and '60, that polled, whether people thought that Democrats, or Republicans treated Black people better, and there really wasn't a whole lot of opinions on this before this Civil Rights Bill. People, there wasn't really a pro-Black party. They were kind of going back and forth on different issues of like New Deal and Red Scare and things like that. But there wasn't, it wasn't until 1964 did the Democrats really become this this pro-civil rights party. And immediately after that, we start seeing studies or surveys where most of the public are starting to identify the Democrats immediately after this bill as the pro-Black and pro-civil rights party. But at the same time, that shifted. Everyone that either opposed civil rights or feared civil rights, started shifting to the Republican Party. So Lyndon Johnson said, after he signed this, he immediately said, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time." And that's basically what happened. Ian Hannity Lopez writes, the GOP would purposely construct a strategy around covert racial appeals that would encompass the whole country and would endure for more than a half century. Johnson himself won that fall, but his 1964 election marked the last time a majority of whites voted for a Democratic presidential candidate. Republicans have carried white majorities in every presidential election since, typically by commanding margins. And we see that even to this day. I mean, Trump, won in every category of a white category. I mean, he didn't win workers. He didn't win, any other major category. He just won the white category. He won the poor white, the middle class white, the rich white, the male white, the female white. The only category he lost, and he barely lost, was white, college educated women. And Hillary won. I think it was just by a couple points. It was a bit, So that's been the case ever since 1964. And then we start seeing this new Southern strategy really solidify with Barry Goldwater. So immediately, they passed the Civil Rights Bill in early '64, and then we have this election. This election in the fall of '64 is basically a referendum on the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And Barry Goldwater, he was part of the early Republicans, the big business, anti-New Deal. We need, unfettered free market capitalism, party that really started forming in the early 1900s. And so he ran on an anti-New Deal platform. And if there's one area of the country that has benefited the most from the New Deal, it was the South. The South benefited, and millions of people's lives were improved, and their livelihoods were tied into the New Deal. They did like the Tennessee Valley, Authority brought electricity to millions of Southerners for the first time ever. The entire livelihoods were wrapped around the New Deal. So it was outrageous to think that the South would vote again, for an anti-New Dealer. And at the same time, the South is still very bitter from the Civil War. So I mean, they've never voted for Republicans, since the Civil War. They're very anti-Republican. But what Barry Goldwater does, as he realizes early that he's not going to win too many Black voters, because he voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. He openly opposes it. He opposed it not because he claims not because he was as racist purposes, but he just thought it was a government overreach because he opposed all big government since the New Deal. But in reality, he actually supported, several federal civil rights legislation before, but he saw this opportunity. So he went down the South and campaigned on this not so much on the New Deal, but on the Anti-Civil Rights Act. So he did, a campaign in the South. He would have these like big events where he would bring, tons of he would have like hundreds of white children and white girls, particularly in these white gowns, do these like parades and stuff. And it was like totally, playing off this anti-Black narrative of like we have to protect white women from and particularly white white young women from Black people. And now that the Civil Rights Act passed, Black people had free reign to terrorize white communities, which was the narrative at the time going around. So the South, who like livelihood was literally tied with the New Deal, voted for an anti-New Deal candidate. Because literally enforcing segregation was more important than their livelihood at this point. So Barry Goldwater, he loses terribly. He wins Arizona, his home state, and he wins the majority of the South. And that you get those states to literally vote against their livelihoods in exchange for overturning a civil rights bill. That was an eye-opening experience for the Republicans. Even though they lost horribly with Lyndon Johnson, they realized just how powerful of a tool that was to oppose the Civil Rights Act, but oppose it in a way that is socially acceptable. Oppose it as government overreach, as states' rights issues, as the freedom of association issues. Don't oppose it as like N-word and lynching and Jim Crow. Make it more socially acceptable. And that was really the first time that people realized how successful, how powerful of a tool the Southern Strategy was. So that's when we see, the first president actually used this, and that strategy. And that was in 1968, and that's when Nixon again was like kind of a pro civil rights person before this. He wasn't perfect. There's a lot of issues, but he supported basic civil rights. He supported basic universal income. If you remember back in the Democratic primaries this year, Andrew Yang talking about giving everyone $1,000 a month. That's a very progressive policy, and Nixon was on board with that. It didn't happen, but he supported it and he wanted it. He supported, at least at the very beginning, he supported suburb integration. Like he brought in, George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, who was a big advocate against integrating the suburbs, and he made him the HUD secretary. But at the same time, he's in the middle of this campaign, and George Wallace is running basically a Southern Strategy campaign, and it's just dominating the polls in the South. So at the last second, he kind of freaks out, and Nixon, turns to some Dixiecrats, turns to Strom Thurmond and other people, and as advisors, and they help him craft this campaign around racial dog whistles. Where all of a sudden now, in the last legs of this race, he starts talking about states' rights. He starts preaching against busing. Talking about law and order, and how this was during, cities were erupting and riots, all over a country based, there were riots based on opposing police brutality and housing discrimination and white supremacy, but it didn't matter. He instead of talking about that, he talked about law and order and the silent majority, and did all these racial dog whistles that felt good, didn't feel like it was racist, but ultimately was about cracking down on Black people trying to rise up against their situation. And again, we have, Nixon's, Haldeman talks about the whole problem is really the Blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not peering to. And John Eldridge, and Nixon's special counsel, also says, we'll go after the racists. Subliminal appeal to the anti-Black voter was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches. And I want to read this. Ian Henry Lowes writes about this new strategy. He says, dismissing these protesters as criminals shifted the issue from the defense of white supremacy to a more neutral sounding concern with order, while simultaneously stripping the activists of moral stature. Demonstrators were no longer Americans willing to risk beating and even death for a grand idea, but rather criminal lowlifes disposed toward antisocial behavior. Ultimately, the language of law and order justified a more quiet form of violence in defense of the racial status quo, replacing lynchings with mass arrests for trespassing and delinquency. By the mid-1960s, law and order had become a surrogate expression for concern about the civil rights movement. Exploiting the growing panic that equated social protests with social chaos, one of Nixon's campaign commercials showed flashing images of demonstrations, riots, police, and violence, over which a deep voice and tone let us recognize that the first right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States. And he's basically saying that what's causing the disorder is the civil rights movement, and not just the peaceful, but also the violent, resistance to white supremacy. And I'm going to play this video a little bit later in a clip of his commercial. It's pretty crazy. But so Nixon barely wins. George Wallace still takes over most of the South. But that really convinces Nixon at this point that, and a lot of political strategists, that Southern strategy is the way to go. Kevin Phillips, a leading Nixon strategist, writes his report the year after that. This is the '68 election. He publishes the Merging Republican Majority, and he talks about, basically he maps out how if the Republicans, through hundreds of pages, maps and charts and all kinds of data, he proves that if the Republicans back this Southern strategy, this coded racial appeals to white voters, that they could dominate the government for a really long time, and they can convince enough Democrats who are for the New Deal and for progressivism to turn their backs on the Democratic Party by highlighting their support for Black people. And he argued that GOP can capture the majority of voters for decades, particularly in the South, particularly in the West, and in suburbia. And he calculated how they could win this, and his predictions came true. They have been dominating since then. And even the Democrats realized this too. There's a book by a Democrat pollster, The Real Majority, that talked about, they warned that, that social issues like supporting civil rights would end up, pushing people away from the Democrats party. And we still hear that today, that, there's big move around, progressive Democrats and liberals complaining about identity politics after 2016 election, saying that, trying to advocate really nicely, identity politics is another racial dog whistle. Instead of saying, hey, we should stop, protecting people's civil rights, they should say, we should stop paying attention to identity politics, or, so it's all just about making these really nice, coded, racial appeals at this point. So by 1972, there's a strategy in place. The Republican Party, adopted it. Nixon goes all in on the Southern strategy, and he literally wins like the biggest, election turnout in the history of this country at this point. Bigger than LBJ in 1964. He just dominates, but he runs on this platform, he abandons a lot of his progressive platforms, like a flat wealth transfer and universal income. He reverses his position on school integration. He decides to fight his HUD. Romney, his HUD secretary, was actually one of the best HUD secretaries that we've ever had. HUD is the Housing Urban Development. He was the only one that refused to give money to cities for developments that were planned, when the city was planning on developing segregated, developments. And most HUD secretaries since then, they stole. HUD is a big funder of segregation, and they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to not give funding to that. And he was literally, as far as I know, he's like the only one that's actually tried to stop that from happening. And Nixon eventually gets rid of him for that, because that's going against his Southern strategy. And then he campaigns on, the silent majority, all these white people, they're just losing out, and are being forgotten. A law and order, busing, welfare, all these things. He declares a war on drugs, and increase the size and presence of the federal drug control agencies, push through mandatory sentencing and no knock warrants. And this is where John Elrick, we read this in the beginning of the class, but he says, this section, he says, you want to know what this is really about. The Nixon campaign in 1968, and this is Nixon's top aide, saying this, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and the Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. In 1972, Nixon, he just wins heavily. He runs against George McGovern, and George McGovern basically says this about the Southern strategy after he loses. What is the Southern strategy? It is this. It says to the South, let the poor stay poor, let your economy trail the nation, forget about decent homes and medical care for all your people, choose officials who will oppose every effort to benefit the many at the expense of the few, and in return, we will try to overlook the rights of the Black man, appoint a few Southerners to high office, and lift your spirits by attacking the Eastern establishment, whose whose bank accounts we were filling with your labor and industry. And so he talks about how, like, the Republican Party is still this anti-New Deal policy, party that's opposing all these, welfare programs and social security nets and programs and all this, like, like healthcare reforms and so they're still opposing all these things that benefit a lot of these white voters, but the white voters are able to overlook that because at the same time they're opposing Black civil rights. So that that attracts a lot of white voters to the party, regardless of the fact that they're being hurt by these anti-New Deal policies. And I want to read this. Edmund Kennedy writes about Nixon's dog whistle strategies. He writes, Nixon decided to appeal to these Wallace-type segregationists while also attracting all these Americans refusing to live in dangerous Black neighborhoods, refusing to believe that Black schools could be equal, refusing to accept busing initiatives to integrate schools, refusing to individualize Black negativity, refusing to believe that Black welfare mothers were deserving, refusing to champion Black power over majority Black counties and cities. All those racists who refused to believe they were racist in 1968. Nixon framed his campaign, as a close advisor explained, to allow a potential supporter to avoid admitting to himself that he was attracted by racist appeals. How would we do that? Easy: demean Black people and praise white people without ever saying Black people or white people. Historians have named this a Southern strategy. In fact, it was and remained over the next 5 decades a national Republican strategy as the GOP tried to unite the Northern and Southern anti-Black racists, war hawks, and fiscal and social conservatives. So I think the key point of this is, people weren't saying, hey, I'm voting for Nixon because I believe in racism. And that's the whole point of this campaign, and it still is to this day, is that people that vote for the Republican Party, they don't realize, they don't feel racist. They don't feel like this is about race, even though Republicans their policies are specifically focused on race, specifically focused on, a lot of the times, especially, like, a lot of times we talked about this in strategic racism. A lot of times they make these anti-Black policies to distract people as they push, neoliberal policies and as they dismantle New Deal and Great Society programs. And then you have the modern Southern strategy. So this is Reagan really takes it off. And Reagan is advised by this guy named Lee Atwater. He's a political strategist for Ronald Reagan. He's a campaign manager for George Bush, Republican National Committee chairman in 1981. And he just, he creates this, like, Reagan definitely took Southern strategy and racial dog whistles to a whole nother level. And this has a big part to do with Lee Atwater. And Lee Atwater actually in the interview, said, and we read this in the beginning section, but he says, you start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busting, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. So they knew, that's the thing, we know that they knew they were doing this because so many of them, all the strategists, they admitted this so often. So Reagan just goes all out in the Southern strategy. Reagan is a candidate that just completely opposes civil rights legislation. He opposed the 64 and 65, civil rights acts. He's very anti-civil rights. But instead of saying that, he creates all these other racial dog whistles. Like a big one is the welfare queen. He would talk about, the story about this, like, this woman, Linda Taylor, she would, like, steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from welfare. She was a Black woman. She would buy Cadillacs and all this stuff. He would sell the story and it was like totally made up. Linda Taylor was a Black woman and she was charged with welfare fraud, but it was like $8,000. It wasn't anything like he was mentioning, but he exaggerated this because he knew there was this this anti-Black narrative where that implied that Black people were lazy and abusive with social programs, and they were undeserving. White people were deserving, but Black people, especially Black women, needed to work. They were just going to abuse the system, be welfare. And they pushed this idea that the welfare programs were primarily serving Black undeserving people. In reality, even to this day, you know, white people are the biggest, you know, receivers of government benefits and welfare programs. But yet there's this perception that it's all being wasted on Black people, and that's a very intentional perception. So Ibram Kendi, you know, talks about, he said, on the presidential campaign trail, Reagan's share the story of Chicago's Linda Taylor, a Black woman charged with welfare fraud. Her tax-free income is over $150,000. Reagan liked to say, actually, Taylor had been charged with defrauding the state of $8,000, an exceptional amount for something that really happened. But truth did not matter to the Reagan campaign as much as feeding the white backlash to Black power. So the welfare queen was a big one that he used. You know, he also used states' rights and let's make America great again. You know, reverse racism was a really big one. This he along with all his judges, federal judges, really pushed back against affirmative action. You know, talking about how everything was fixed. You know, we fixed everything with Civil Rights Act, so we don't need affirmative action. This is actually reverse racism to white people, and he used that narrative to attack civil rights enforcement and bills and desegregation efforts and busing. He was, you know, he pushed the whole tough on crime, war on drugs. It was a made-up war on drugs to basically distract, you know, to push this anti-narrative that Black people were dangerous and had to be violently, you know, oppressed with law and order. In reality, you know, Black people were not doing drugs any more than white people, but you know, and he, you know, but it's just that policing was only, you know, it was heavily focused on Black communities. Black communities were over policed, so it made this, you know, appearance that Black people were more, you know, inclined to being criminals and drug dealers, and he really used that to stoke a lot of fear and push a lot of you know, this mass incarceration and war on drugs, as he was, you know, also cutting taxes and big government, cutting welfare, cutting social programs, safety nets, and pushing these neoliberal policies that just decimated that we're still recovering from. I'm going to read this from Ian Hannity Lopez writes, Reagan's campaign against welfare helped make the case for tax cuts by successfully using social programs like welfare, its implicit connection to integration, to convince voters that the real danger in their lives came from a looming intrusive government. During the Reagan era, for the first time since the onset of the Great Depression, significant cultural spaces opened up to present government rather than concentrated wealth as the greatest threat to freedom faced by the middle class. In turn, massive tax cuts were sold as the appropriate way to restrain a looming intrusive state. The point is not that Reagan or other Republican administration had reduced the size of government. On the contrary, they repeatedly vastly expanded federal power and dramatically increased the national debt, not least through unsustainable tax giveaways to the rich. The point rather is that they sold tax cuts to the rich and viewed the whole agenda of reduced regulation / services as an expression of hostility toward a liberal government. I want to play this. We played this in the last section, but I want to play this now. It's a short video. Ian Hannity Lopez. He talks about Ronald Reagan's strategic racism and how he begins his 1980 campaign.
So we know Ronald Reagan used to talk about welfare queens, but he also had this other stump speech that he would give. He would speak to his audiences and he would say, understand how frustrating it is for you when you're standing in line at a grocery store waiting to buy a hamburger, and there's some young fellow ahead of you buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Now, the first time he told that tale, it wasn't some young fellow, he said some young buck. And the young buck was a racially coded term that stood for a strong African-American man. And so that term, that moved from being a dog whistle to an outright racial provocation. Reagan backed off and he started talking about some young fellow buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Think about the characters in this story. The first character is the person buying a T-bone steak with food stamps, and that's conjuring the image of the lazy minority who's strong, who could work, but who doesn't want to work and prefers to be on welfare. But the other image is the you in that story, who Reagan's talking to. And the you is ostensibly the voter, the hardworking taxpayer, the law-abiding American. That voter, that hardworking American implicitly has a racial identity, and that's white. So there you can see this racial narrative. You, Reagan is saying to white audiences, you're being taken advantage of. There's a third character here, government.
It's government ostensibly that is taking advantage of whites, that is taking their money through taxes and then giving it to these undeserving minorities. So what did Reagan suggest? He suggested tax cuts. You shouldn't have to pay taxes to a government that's just taking your money and giving it to minorities. And indeed, what did he do? He enacted tax cuts. In the first year of his tax cuts, $164 billion went to American corporations. Over the 1980s, the Reagan tax cuts transferred $1 trillion to America's top 1%. Yes, voters got the tax cuts they thought were aimed at cutting off undeserving minorities. But in fact, it was a politics that was showering money on the very richest Americans. We have to understand the way in which something has fundamentally changed in American politics. We used to understand that the biggest threat in a political life was the power of concentrated money, the power of big money and of corporations to hijack the marketplace and to hijack government. But now Republicans for 50 years have been telling voters the biggest threat in your life is that minorities are going to hijack government. The government has been taken over and now serves them. So when white voters vote against government, they think they're voting against minorities, but in fact, they're voting to give over control of government back to the very rich, back to the big corporations.
All right. Then we'll read a couple more quotes about Reagan's dog whistle campaign. This comes from Michelle Alexander from the new Jim Crow. Really fantastic book about the rise of mass incarceration. She writes, to great effect, Reagan echoed white frustration in race-neutral terms through implicit racial appeals. His colorblind rhetoric on crime, welfare, taxes, and states' rights was clearly understood by white and black voters as having a racial dimension, though claims to that effect were impossible to prove. The absence of explicitly racist rhetoric afforded the racial nature of his coded appeals a certain plausible deniability. For example, when Reagan kicked off his presidential campaign at the annual Neshpala County Fair near Philadelphia, Mississippi, the town where 3 civil rights activists were murdered in 1964, he assured the crowd, "I believe in states' rights," and promised to restore to states the local governments the power that properly belonged to them. His critics promptly alleged that he was signaling a racial message to his audience, suggesting allegiance with those who resisted desegregation, but Reagan firmly denied it, forcing liberals into a position that would soon become familiar, arguing that something is racist, but finding it impossible to prove in the absence of explicitly racist language. And I should understand, like, I mean, this was like a big case where, people, it was freedom summers where people would come down to the South to help register people to vote. In Philadelphia, Mississippi, 3 people, were kidnapped and murdered. And so he literally went to that town, and was basically like, "I believe in states' rights." The same, the same narrative that allowed, that justified those murders in the first place, and to justify voter suppression and Jim Crow and segregation. And we have to understand Reagan neoliberal, the impact of his neoliberal divestments that had on the Black community. And we're going to talk more about this. We're going to have a whole class on neoliberalism. But Reagan, neoliberalism is basically believing in the market so much that you want to cut, all kinds of social safety nets, cut, government regulations, and just letting the market control everything. It's also called like things like trickle down economics, with this idea that if the rich, can make a lot of money, they'll spend it and it'll all trickle down. Reality is, we know from lots of evidence, it's the complete opposite. When you give the money to the rich, oftentimes that's they use that, for example, in the COVID relief fund, we gave all this funding to all these rich corporations thinking it was going to trickle down. Instead, they used it to buy back their stocks and to gain even more wealth. But if we give money to the poor, they're going to spend that on mortgages and rents and utilities and necessities, and that is what's going to really stimulate the economy, and it's going to build up the economy and produce jobs. But instead, we focus on, we have very neoliberal economics, and what that's happening is, particularly since Reagan, so we're seeing an explosion of wealth that's being accumulated into the top 1%, and while at the same time we're seeing everyone else just lose wealth, over the last couple of decades. So, and that has a lot to do with these neoliberal policies. So Reagan, so he drastically divested and cut welfare, HUD programs, social safety nets, public health programs, while increasing military budget, increasing rich tax breaks, increasing lower, he lowered the top tax rate from 70% to 28%, while increasing payroll taxes and starting, so instead of the rich paying a lot of money, he lowered their tax rate and then increased payroll taxes. So workers now had to pay what the rich used to pay. So he did this massive transfer of wealth to the upper class through, a fake war on crime, drugs, through mass incarceration, through military contracts, through tax cuts to the rich. At the same time, he just like drastically cuts. 500,000, families lose eligibility for aid-assisted families with dependent children. That's what the welfare program was before Clinton took it, reformed it. Million children lost reduced price school lunches. 600,000 people lost Medicaid. Millions lost food stamps. It closed, hundreds of urban hospitals and rural hospitals. And launched an epidemic of homelessness. Significantly increased inequality and infant mortality and childhood, diseases and population of people living without health insurance. But ultimately, all these things, it literally reduced the life expectancy of Black Americans. So Black people during Reagan's era literally lived less. Their life expectancy shortened through his policies. So I'll read this. Eduardo Monaliva Bonilla Silva writes, written Racism Without Racists. Reagan cast himself as a traditional conservative, but his disdain for big government was geared not so much towards New Deal programs that had provided paid employment to millions of out-of-work Americans like his father, or Social Security, which had overwhelmingly benefited whites during the Great Depression. What President Reagan loathed was the Great Society, that despite its dispersals of benefits to middle-class whites and its measurable effectiveness in lifting elderly out of poverty, he succeeded in coding as a giveaway program for Blacks. His budget priorities reflected that contempt, as he ordered a scorched earth policy through the Great Society, from education to housing to employment. The median family income for African Americans had been higher in the 1970s than it was under Reagan, even as a white median income, despite the economic downturn, continued to grow. As a result, the actual spending power of Blacks decreased while that of whites rose, increasing the gap by 12%. In virtually every area of life that counts, wrote David Sweden, future president of the United Negro College Fund, Black people made strong progress in the 1960s, peaked in the 1970s, and have been sliding back ever since. Reagan's administration's deplorable policies and efforts to turn back the clock ensured it. Indeed, by 1990, Blacks in the bottom 20% were poorer in relation to whites than at any time since the 1950s. And then I want to talk about two significant things that Reagan has done around discrimination and racism, redefining these concepts. And this is important because this is were big factors why a lot of people don't understand racism to this day, or don't understand policies addressing racism. This is again from the book Racism Without Racists. And it's a long quote, but it's worth understanding. So he says, both Nixon and Reagan administrations, with the support of the Berger and Rehnquist Supreme Courts, executed two significant tasks to crush the promise embedded in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this talks about, in the 1960s, they passed all kinds of great, civil rights bills, from the 64 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act 68, that basically outlawed discrimination and voting and housing and public accommodations in schools. But just passing legislation isn't enough. You need the courts to kind of set up legal precedents. And what the courts did is Nixon and Reagan over the 70s and 80s pointed, we saw that a majority of the Supreme Court justices in the last 50 years were appointed by Republicans. And they appointed Republicans who, specifically were very intentionally, focused on dismantling these civil rights bills, or at least their ability to enforce, to protect, and to force these bills against discrimination. Eduardo Banalas Silva writes, the first was to redefine what the movement was really about. With centuries of oppression and brutality suddenly reduced to the harmless symbolism of a bus seat and a water fountain. Thus, when the colored-only signs went down, inequality had supposedly disappeared. By 1965, Richard Nixon asserted almost every legislative roadblock to equality of opportunity for education, jobs, and voting had been removed. Also magically removed by this interpretation were up to $24 trillion in multi-generational devastation that African Americans had suffered and lost wages, stolen land, educational impoverishment, and housing inequalities. All of that vanished as if it had never happened. Whereas Patrick Buchanan, advisor to Richard Nixon and presidential campaign himself, would explain decades later, America had been the best country on earth for Black folks. It was here that 600,000 Black people brought from Africa to enslaved ships grew into a community of 40 million, were introduced to Christian salvation and reached inordinate wealth and molted into and reach the greatest levels of freedom and prosperity Blacks had ever known. Similarly, chattel slavery, which built the United States inordinate wealth, molded into an institution which few, if any, whites have ever benefited because their families never owned slaves. Once the need for the civil rights movement was minimized and history rewritten, initiatives like President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and affirmative action, which were developed to commemorate hundreds of years of violent and corrosive repression, were easily characterized as reverse discrimination against hardworking whites, a government handout that lazy Black people chose to take rather than work. So one of the first things they did was just erase this history of literally trillions of dollars of lost wealth in Black communities, and relates this idea that white people ever are benefited from slavery because my family never owned slaves, and even though slavery created the institutions in this country that white people are still benefiting from. So it's created this idea that racism and on all the harm that was done by racism and slavery and Jim Crow and housing discrimination and redlining, that was a thing of the past, and everything's been fixed. So now any attempt to kind of fix, systemic racism is actually reverse racism. So Reagan particularly, pushed this, this idea very hard. And the second key maneuver, which flowed naturally from the first, was to redefine racism itself. Confronted with civil rights headlines depicting unflattering portrayals of KKK rallies and jackbooted sheriffs, white authority transformed those damning images of white supremacy into the sole definition of racism. This simple but wickedly brilliant conceptual linguistic shift served multiple purposes. First and foremost, it was a conscious soothing. The whittling down of racism to sheet-wearing goons allowed a cloud of racial innocence to cover many whites who, although resentful of Black progress and determined to ensure that racial equality remained untouched, could see and project themselves as the kind of upstanding white citizens who were positively outraged at the tactics of the Ku Klux Klan. The focus on the Klan also helped to designate racism as an individual aberration rather than something systemic, institutional, and pervasive. Moreover, isolating racism to only its most viral and visible form allowed respectable politicians and judges to push for policies that obstinately met the standard Americans' new civil rights norms, while at the same time crafting the implementation of policies that undermine and destabilize those norms, all too often leaving Black communities ravaged. So the second part was about, redefining what racism is. Racism is only these, these crazy, bigots in the South, Bull Connor and the KKK, that was racism. Everyone else who's voting for politicians that are pushing racist policies, against, school integration and housing discrimination and things, although that's not racism. Those are actually upstanding white citizens. So they like disconnected white people who were perpetuating racism to ever having to feel like they were connected to that racism. And these two things, this is, why, most white people don't understand racism today. And they still to this day think that racism is this explicit hate and not systems and internalizations that we're all part of. So the last thing he says, objective was to contain and neutralize the victories of the civil rights movement by painting the picture of a colorblind, equal society whose doors were now wide open. If only African Americans would take the initiative and walk through this. And we saw this not only on the political level, but also the judicial level, where all the Supreme Court justices that Nixon and Reagan appointed pushed this idea that we now live in a colorblind society, and so they fought against affirmative action. They fought against any kind of, civil rights, especially enforcing the civil rights bills. Like they came up with this idea of proof of malice, that you have to have, explicit proof that, if a white person is pushing a policy that's discriminating against black people, you have to have specific proof, like yes, in writing, say I'm racist and I'm trying to do racist policies, which is like, never going to happen. But they basically just dismantle the federal government's ability to enforce a lot of the civil rights acts, particularly around, enforcing, the outlaw of discrimination. So then we move up to the Bush Senior, who, right off the bat, I mean, a lot of people will claim he won. The only reason why he won is his single-term presidency is because of racial dog whistles, particularly tough on crime. He has a particular ad, Willie Horton. I'll show it. We'll play this video at the end of the section, but Willie Horton, basically, he ran against Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts, that had this program, this belief. It was a furlough program. It was this belief that people on death, or on serving life sentences, had no motivation for good behavior. But if they can, win things like weekend furloughs, then they would have much better behavior. And Willie Horton was, one of them. I don't know how successful that program was, or I don't know much about it. But Willie Horton was one of them that won a weekend, furlough, and then and committed some horrific acts, some murders and rapes. And so they used this campaign. They basically showed this picture of this black person and talked about these horrific crimes, and basically said, if it implied that Dukakis was weak on black criminals. And within Willie Horton political ad turned 12% of elective basically Bush won 12% of voters in 1 month with this ad. So Lee Atwater, who was working with Bush and organized this whole campaign, said by the time we finished, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Dukakis' running mate. So the whole point was to scare white people by making them think that Dukakis and black criminals are all on the same team. And then at the same time, we see this emergence of this PC culture and these free speech dog whistles, which we have a whole, we have several sections in previous classes that talk about this. I'll give you a really quick synopsis, and then if you want to read more, this is a really great article to kind of dive more into the deeper, into the history of political correctness. The political correctness it was created by the political right. No one used this term political correctness before the late 80s, early 90s, and they were it's basically it was a network of conservative donors, Koch brothers, and all different kinds of families who were financing these think tanks to try to, create this, basically to create this divide among Democrats and among the working class and the academia, to create this elitist, feeling in Democrats, to demonize and exaggerate, anyone that's trying to stand up and challenge systemic racism, and also patriarchy and homophobia and things like that, to basically make, racism, sexism, and homophobia like socially acceptable. And how they did this is instead of so if you say something that perpetuates, racism or sexism, and someone calls you out, you don't have to defend that anymore. All you have to do is say, I'm a victim of out of control PC culture. And then, you see this with Trump, when he ran in 2016, they would confront him on really racist and sexist things that he did, and instead of answering that or defending himself, he would just say, "I don't bow down to PC culture," and the whole audiences would blow up. So they really pushed this idea that there's this whole fascist free speech movement that was happening, or anti-free speech movement that was happening, and that was attacking white people and making them feel bad for saying racist and sexist things. So they hired all kinds of authors. Literally, no one has ever written about political correctness until 1990, and all of a sudden they hired people to write thousands of articles around how this political correctness movement was destroying our democracy and our free speech, and it was raging through academic world, and it was it had titles like the rising hegemony of the political correct, thought police, the new fascists. It would cherry pick a few instances and exaggerate it to make it seem like it was horrific. This is a horrific anti-free speech movement. And at this point, most Americans had never even heard of PC before. And then in 1991, President Bush, and decides to jump in on this, and basically gives a speech about PC being one of the biggest dangers in the U.S. He says, ironically, on the 200th anniversary of our Bill of Rights, we find free speech under assault throughout the United States. The notion of political correctness has united controversial across the land. In their own Orwellian way, crusades that demand correct behavior crush diversity in the name of diversity. And we see this, this is a great quote from Mariah Wiglum, wrote, some really great articles about, history of political correctness. She says, if you search ProQuest, a digital database of US magazines and newspapers, you find that the phrase political correct rarely appeared before 1990. That year, it turned up more than 700 times. In 1991, there was more than 2,500 instances. In 1992, it appeared more than 2,800 times. Like Indiana Jones movies, these pieces called up enemies that melange of old wars. They've compared the thought police spreading terror on university campuses to fascists and Stalinists and McCarthyites and Hitler Youth and Christian fundamentalists and Maoists and Marxists. So you see, this whole, these network, this is a whole political right movement, political movement in the 1990s. It just came out of nowhere, like from no one writing about it, all of a sudden thousands of articles written by, at first it was written by conservatives, like Alan Bloom and Roger Kimball, Dinesh D'Souza, but then, more modern, writers were buying into this and started writing as well, and just became this, it's just this like pandemic, that spread all over the country. And it's a powerful tool by the political right to basically demonize anyone fighting civil rights or fighting, and not to say that people, we all need to, learn better ways to call each other out, or hopefully call in more, and we need to, I'm not saying that there's definitely issues of that, but just because someone gets angry at someone for being racist doesn't excuse the racism, and that's what this all is about, is like, demonizing the people trying to call out, racism and sexism and homophobia. All right, so then that takes us to the Democrats, the New Democrats, which is this new phrase that Clinton starts. And basically, he recognizes that Reagan, just dominates in his elections and wins over a huge portion of white Democrats. So he wants to basically out neoliberal the GOP. He wants to out, mass incarcerate, out just, fight welfare, out, anti-immigrant, immigration, policy. He wants to push policies that outdo the Republicans, and he's able to win a lot of voters back over to the Democrats, a lot of white voters, and he does this by running on Reagan. It's hard to tell who is more involved in the rise of mass incarceration, Reagan or Clinton, but Clinton was huge. He passed one of the largest violent crime control and law enforcement act, one of the largest crime bills that pumped in billions into building new prisons and more police, and passing these really horrific rules like 3-strike rules, and that just start blowing up our prison population. At the same time, he dismantles welfare. He runs on a welfare reform campaign, using dog whistles, pushing this idea that welfare is just being abused by Black people, so let's just dismantle and reform it, and basically just destroys our welfare program and turns it into a block grant program, like we call TANF, where states have so much authority now to deny people, particularly Black people, assistance. He puts like lifetime bans on food stamps for welfare people with drug convictions. He puts institute work requirements. He excludes immigrants and teenage mothers, decreases funding for nutritious assistance programs. And a lot of people credit Reagan for decreasing poverty, and he does. The overall poverty rate he decreased, and at least from if you step back, it looks like he did a lot of good, and he did do a lot, but at the same time, he blew up what we call deep poverty. So that's people living below 50% below the poverty line. That has just exploded because he basically kicked off, before the reforms, 2/3 of families with children in poverty received welfare benefits. After his reforms, a quarter of it did. He kicked off millions of people, mostly children, families with children, off of welfare programs, pushing this idea that they were all just abusing the system, and that we needed to cut them off because they were all undeserving. When in reality, a lot of them really needed these assistance programs, and threw millions of people into real deep poverty. And at the same time, he pushes, to defund public housing. He deregulates Wall Street, pushes the Defense of Marriage Act, trying to, win over religious voters and religious white voters that were opposed to gay marriage. He does a lot of pretty horrific things. Pramila Nadasen writes, Clinton simultaneously expansion of federal law enforcement and the shrinking of the federal workforce to its lowest levels in 30 years reallocated taxpayer dollars from employing people in social service jobs to putting more cops on the streets. So yes, he did, balance the budget, but he did that by basically throwing people, enormous amount of people into off of welfare into deep poverty, and then taking that money and expanding prisons and expanding cops, so it's a mixed review for sure with Clinton. So I want to read Michelle Alexander from the New Jim Crow writes, despite claims that these radical policy changes were driven by fiscal conservatism, i.e. the desire to end big government and slash and burn budget deficits, the reality is that government was not reducing the amount of money devoted to the management of the urban poor. It was radically altering what the funds would be used for. The dramatic shift towards punitiveness resulted in a massive reallocation of public resources. By 1996, the penal budget doubled the amount that had been allocated to the DC or food stamps. That was a welfare program before his reforms. Similarly, funding that had once been used for public housing was being redirected to prison construction. During Clinton's tenure, Washington slashed funding for public housing by $17 billion, a 61% reduction, and boosted corrections by $19 billion, and 171% increase, effectively making the construction of prisons the nation's main housing program for the poor. And then we get, to Bush Jr., Romney, and some other elections. So Bush Jr., he ran on this. He didn't start out doing a whole lot of racial dog whistles. He ran on what we call compassionate conservatism. It was this idea that with enough guidance, the free market, could, help alleviate poverty. It was kind of like a watered down version of neoliberal, like Reagan's neoliberal government. That was until 9/11 hit. And then from there, he continued to run a lot of Islamophobia, racial dog whistles, where, all you have to do is say Sharia law, and that invokes this fear of all Muslims and Islamic terrorism. And that's why Republicans are really, adamant about people saying Islamic terrorism and not just a terrorism, because that, makes this false connection that all, Muslims are in some way connected to terrorism, or Islam is a violent religion. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But for the most part, a lot of racial dog whistles currently started, dying down. Romney brings back a little bit of it, where he talks about, welfare reform and big government again. And despite, running a terrible campaign, he still wins majority of white voters. And then we see the Tea Party rise. During Obama's, election in 2009 and 10. We're gonna have a whole section on the Tea Party, so you can learn more about that. But we start seeing, again, big government, welfare, reform, bailouts, socialism, communism, all different kinds of racial dog whistles, and just normal, Red Scare dog whistles as well. And then we have immigration of, see a lot of Islamophobia, and then the big voter fraud myth. We're going to kind of dive deeper into a lot of this. But overall, a lot of this, even though it's still present, is kind of dying down a little bit. Or at least it was until Obama, and then it starts picking up again for sure. And that's when we get to Trump. And it's really important to understand because Trump is so explicit, because he has no problem being explicitly racist. Relaunched the campaign calling Mexican immigrants, rapists and drug dealers, and that's just one of many different explicit, racist things he said. So a lot of people will claim that the racial dog whistles died with Trump because as editorial board of USA Today says, Trump turned turns GOP dog whistles into bullhorns. But in reality, he's using tons of dog whistles. I mean, his very campaign is "Make America Great." That same racial dog whistle that Reagan used to push, reverse racism myths, and the idea that we were a lot better off before Black people started getting civil rights and affirmative action. So that's one. He pushes the anti-PC, the cancel culture is big, welfare reform, cutting taxes, inner city, law and order. Law and order is being pushed big time as he's violently cracking down on people protesting police brutality right now. He's pushing this myth that Antifada is anti-fascist, which is just an idea. And he's pushing that it's an actual real organization and it's a terrorist and they're like destroying cities, when in fact even even when you see these anti-fascist protests, there are a couple blocks in the city and nothing's I mean even if there's like is vandalism and stuff, it's not, they're not burning down entire cities, but he's pushing this myth to kind of scare people about that these are the real criminals and we have to be scared about this. Don't worry about what I'm doing with COVID right now. He's really big on protecting the suburbs. A lot of racial dog whistles around there. He tweeted as he was dismantling the Obama HUD rule that basically said that I think it was like that cities had to analyze their housing and find if they found racial discrimination, they had to create plans that they had to submit to the federal government on how to address it. And he removed that and basically tweeted, "I'm happy to inform all of you people living their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood." So again, he pushes this idea that he's protecting the suburbs. He never actually says by Black criminals, Black people invading, but that's the idea of that. The racial dog whistle behind that is that by maintaining white, housing discrimination, these white suburbs can continue to, be protected by keeping Black people criminals out. Xenophobia, dog whistles, a lot of Islamic terrorism, criminal alien, he's run his campaign, particularly in 2016 and 18, demonizing, immigrants and causing all kinds of, racial, violence towards them. He uses these racial dog whistles called, he talks about COVID, he says things like China, the China virus or Chinese virus or Kung flu. And this is to push this idea that this is Chinese people are responsible for this. Yes, it did come from it originated, the pandemic COVID came from China, but it's not like we had plenty of time. We had so much time. He knew how dangerous this pandemic was going to be back in February, and he politicized it and called it a Democratic hoax instead of preparing for it. So the deaths that are on the 200,000 are on his hands. But instead, he says these things to kind of push the blame and scapegoat, China. But what the real dangerous part about this is it also pushes violence against Chinese Americans. Ever since he started using these racial dog whistles, we've seen an explosion of violence. Thousands of cases, and that's just what's being recorded. Of violence and discrimination and assaults and against Asian Americans right now. And every time he uses this, it just increases. He says things like open borders, trying to, make people like Democrats who want to do, immigration reform seem like they're on the same team with these dangerous criminal immigrants, and they're just letting everyone come into this country. And then he's got a lot of anti-democratic and anti-Semitic and Red Scare dog whistles, like voting is rigged, fake liberal media. Anytime media attacks him, it's fake and it's liberal. Deep state, he constantly talks about this like conspiracy theories, that secret plots that are against him. A lot of this has anti-Semitic, feelings of like this, Jews behind the scene, sowing chaos, to try to, destroy him. The radical left, anytime he has opposition to anything, like he constantly calls the other side radical left, even if they're just pushing moderate policies, because this brings up that Red Scare and that they're associated with these terrorists. They're burning our cities right now. Soros is a big one, and he pushes a lot of. George Soros is a big philanthropist. billionaire that invests a lot in progressive and pro-democracy initiatives, and he's a frequent target of the political right when they push anti-Semitic narratives that he's actually behind the scenes. Like he was the one that pays protesters to protest Trump. He's paid migrant caravans to come into this country. And it's actually caused a lot of dangerous reactions, particularly in 2018. That was the main campaign that, slogan that Trump was using was these dangerous immigrant caravans were coming to America, and they were being sponsored by George Soros and this Jewish plot to sow chaos in America. And one of his followers actually decided to go to Pittsburgh and shoot up a synagogue that particularly worked on relocating refugees from south of the border. And he chose that specifically and wrote in his manifest, basically word for word what Trump was saying, that the Jews are destroying our country by bringing in dangerous immigrant caravans, and it resulted in the largest Jewish massacre in the history of this country. So yeah, Trump is super racist, but at the same time, racial dog whistles have not stopped at all. And the thing is, you can ask any, the vast majority of people voting for Trump, even though they're on board with most of these racial dog whistles, at the same time, they don't consider any of this racist. They don't see this as race. We're just trying to protect suburbs. We're just trying to, law and order. We're just trying to, or I see a lot like, why can't we call it Chinese virus, if it came from China, and no understanding the implications and the racial violence that's following a lot of this stuff. So. All right, so I'm going to end this on a video for Francesca Forienti. She does this really great video. She's a reporter for Newsbroke. We're going to play a couple of her videos today. She's a little bit cheesy, but I'm not playing this for the comedy aspect. I'm playing this because her content is pretty awesome. And she does this like overview of a lot of these anti-Black dog whistles, and a lot of these racial dog whistles over the last all the presidents that we talked about. And she just does a really great job. She shows a lot of the videos that we've been talking about in the commercials and ads. So I'm just going to end this section on this video.
What Trump has left is what's been at the center of his presidency this entire time: white identity politics, stoking white Americans' fear of Black and brown people. And with Black Lives Matter organizers demanding racial justice and police accountability and then being brutalized by the police, Trump is now banking his entire reelection on it. Here's just a sampling of proof from this summer's buffet of bigotry.
These people are vandals, but they're agitators, but they're terrorists.
There will be no more low-income housing forced into the suburbs. It's been hell for suburbia.
Michael Cohen in a damning new tell-all claiming President Trump once said Hispanic voters, like Black voters in his words, are too stupid to vote for him.
Why are African Americans still dying at the hands of law enforcement in this country?
And so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people.
You're probably wondering, what went wrong in this workplace interaction? Catherine Herridge asks President Trump a question that hinted at the existence of racism, and that made him uncomfortable. I wish that video wasn't relevant. Most chillingly, Trump has been sending federal officers to cities like Kenosha, Portland, and Chicago, where protesters have been disappeared into unmarked vehicles, relentlessly tear-gassed, and targeted by extremists. And right-wing commentators have justified the federal crackdown with some choice comparisons.
This is going on every night that Portland looks like Baghdad.
Carnage is as intense as it is in Chicago, far more than in Baghdad.
Last month, the gang members shot 15 people outside a funeral home in Chicago. It looked like Fallujah.
Funny, the whole comparing American cities to Iraqi ones, because that would make federal officers an occupying army, which is strange because I thought the U.S. Army loved when locals tear down statues. Remember when these same pundits said Trump would be an isolationist against foreign wars? Turns out they were right. America First wasn't just a slogan. It was a list of where to invade. America first, China second, countries third. And while all of this is so horrific,
Nothing Trump does is original. Not the campaign slogan, not sending in federal troops to quell protests, not even getting impeached for trying to get dirt on a political opponent. That was this year, people. When is time again? Many presidential hopefuls and incumbents have resorted to demonizing the black community and social movements to win elections. The term law and order, essentially loving the police real hard, was coined in 1964 by Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater.
We want the brightness of examples that will inspire law and order in this land, not the darkness that encourages crime.
The darkness that encourages crime? Wow, it's like he's inventing racist dog whistles before our very eyes. He's like the Chuck Berry of hating people who look like Chuck Berry. And for the zombie campaign that came out of the pet cemetery, Law and Order is now just a series of sporadic all-caps tweets, you know, because of the worms in the brain. Richard Nixon ran and won the presidency on a law and order platform in the midst of massive social movements in 1968. You know, the year that used to hold title for most volatile that I will now refer to as NERF 2020. Nixon took advantage of fears around black power and left-wing activists and their perceived lawlessness. Just look at this campaign ad.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
Sweet mother of God, what did those sick hippies do with the rest of that mannequin's body? I told you that's what smoking grass does. Also, wait, go back. Is that Matt Leib? How is that possible?
What are you talking about? It looks nothing like me. Dad?
And what do you know? Some 50 years later, the zombie campaign is running ads like this.
This is a taste of Biden's America. I mean, the rioting, the crime, freedom is at stake now. And this is going to be the most important election of our lifetime.
Is it Biden's America? Because that slow motion footage is actually stock footage from Spain. And also, Trump is president. So that would make this Trump's America. Trump's deliberately ratcheting up violence by sending in federal troops and encouraging vigilantism, and then claiming he's the only one who can stop it. At this point, it's not really a presidency, it's a mafia protection racket. It'd be a shame if something like Portland happened to your town. I can help with that. Nixon also called in the National Guard on thousands of DC anti-war demonstrators in the largest sweep arrest in U.S. history. A move not unlike Trump's when he tear-gassed demonstrators outside of the White House in a stage stunt to prove he reads the Bible. Then in the 70s and 80s, another made-for-TV politician, Ronald Reagan, doubled down on Nixon's race baiting. Before his run at the White House, Reagan had built a name for himself as governor of California by sending in California's National Guard to violently put down demonstrators. This is like a rite of passage. Even before his racist war on drugs and so-called welfare queens, Reagan's presidential campaign was premised on the idea that the civil rights movement had gone too far, and that the real racism was against white people through things like affirmative action or fairness in hiring. Here he is in a campaign video criticizing busing to integrate public schools.
The money now being wasted on this social experiment could be better spent to provide the kind of school facilities every child deserves.
Facilities like brand new bathrooms that only white students can use. What? We've done that? Oh. And did you separate the drinking fountains? Okay, well, I'm just spitballing. And now the undead incarnation of Reagan is trying to do away with federal diversity training programs because apparently they're divisive. George Bush Sr. in 1989 called his opponent, Democratic Governor Michael Dukakis, soft on crime in this classic and pretty horrific ad.
He allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Yowza! Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Waka waka waka. And finally, you had the Republican, who for some reason said he was a Democrat and picked up where Reagan's welfare reform and mass incarceration left off. Clinton ran his re-election bid on the crime bill, which he signed during his first term.
100,000 more police on the streets, expand the death penalty. That's how we'll protect America.
No, that's how you'll lose the right to ever speak about racial justice ever again.